Okay, guys, would you believe that Fife Generation stuck on their £5,433 million tied up in equity? QVT. That's £5 billion tied up in equity. That's a huge number for Generation Stuck. We're going to talk about this. I mean, this is a huge number, right? And we're going to talk about why Generation Stuck. And Generation Stuck is really because the baby boomers. Is it the case that they're actually stopping the Generation X from actually upgrading? They're sitting in houses that are far too big for them. But they've technically got nowhere else to go.
Nope. What's quite scary for me is I've just realised I'm in Generation 6 in the age bracket.
So the predicament here is that the predicament of the Fife 20 to 30-year-olds who rent and their inability to get into the housing ladder, onto the housing ladder, is often discussed in the press.
Yeah.
Richard, there are 4.3 million properties now. So there's 4.3 million properties right now in the UK that are still in private rented sector compared to 2.2 million in 2002. I mean, that's doubled the amount of properties, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're more than well aware, Jim, that there's a shortage in housing. And I mean, the 20 to 30-year-olds, I mean, I am past that now, but obviously I've just no long come to that period and trying to get on the property ladder and things as well. So I'm well aware of how that situation works. But it's true, as you say, I mean, there's a lot of the older generation who are in houses that they've got their family that's flew to the nest, and these houses could be ideal for people in like the late 20s, 30s age who are starting a family. But they've nowhere to move to either because we've got that shortage of housing. So it has a knock-on effect, definitely.
So let's go to Perry and say, how do we solve that?
How do we solve that,
Perry? I mean, I think there is a housing shortage there, but I think there's also an element of it. I mean, I know I experienced it myself. So
I was just going to say, Perry, you just went through that, yeah.
You know, I downsized exactly as you guys know. So I downsized about coming up for a year ago now, gosh. And at the time of buying that property, which was really too big for us at the time we bought it, but we bought it with the thing in mind that actually our family and our extended family would come and stay.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, that rarely happens. So actually, 95% of the time, the property was just occupied by the two of us and a dog.
Yeah.
And so I kind of did accept that actually, for me, if they do want to come and stay, it would be financially more beneficial for me to give up the expenditure of this house that I was upkeeping. And well, they can stay in a nice hotel or something if they want to come and stay.
But you've still got the spare room anyway, so I mean.
Yeah, you do have that, but you know, if you were having everybody at one time, which generally will happen, maybe Christmases or something, it just for me defeated the purpose of having a big home. To be honest, that you had all this upkeep on. But actually, I see the challenge actually that Generation Stuck have as well, because I know for myself when we sold, we went into rental. The view was to downsize into something that was more comfortable for us in the size and but actually finding something was a challenge. So you know, actually the property that's out there, you know, if you've got a specific thing in mind, it's difficult to find it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Perry. You went through that and you made that decision. I thought, right, I'm downsizing. But it was a long journey to find that right property to move to, or any property really, that suited you, because and that was, well, you're saying just over a year ago, but we're still in that situation where there's a shortage of housing for people to downsize to allow people to then move up the property ladder.
Yeah. So, I mean, my initial reaction to this is we need to build more houses. Is that really the case, or does this article actually show us something different? I mean, the group of people in their 20 to 30s who rent from private landlords is often called generation rent. Yet, would it surprise you that since 2017, the number of UK households in the private rented sector has reduced by 260,000, whilst the number of homeowners has increased by 1.1 million? Everybody says that all the time. What's this thing we get all the time, Richard, is about the fact that all these investors and all these landlords taking these properties. But the reality is the number of homeowners has actually increased by 1.1 million against the number of private landlords and investors has actually decreased by 260,000 right across the UK.
It is surprising, and given the current situation of things, people should really be welcoming new investors and landlords who are picking up property and making them available for the market for people to rent. We've seen a lot more people choosing to rent due to circumstances, or whether that be financial, or whether that be their situation and being able to get onto the property ladder, or even simply just finding a home. But yeah, it is interesting that there's been a lot more first-time buyers as opposed to obviously available properties for rent.
We're definitely seeing that, and I would say that's where a proportion of that home ownership increase is coming from. It is actually that first-time buyers, people now getting back on the ladder, and it tends to be that generation stuck that actually have a bit of a mindset of, I don't want to sell because I won't find what I want, and I don't want to be homeless, and they have this mindset, so actually they stay where they are rather than make that choice. So we do see a kind of an influx of first-time buyers, but actually at the high end is where it's getting stuck, and it's the kind of middle part that seems to be doing all the moving and shaking.
Yeah. So this is the point. We're not really talking about generation rent here. We're talking about generation stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, generation stuck are our middle-aged and mature homeowners in Fife.
Yeah.
They're the generation that could be described as the baby boomers, the late baby boomers. That's the 1950s to 1960s. So that's when you're born. That's the round about there. And the early generation X's, that's the mid 60s to the 1970s, which is basically us. And I could understand that, how you would be generation stuck, because it isn't easy to downsize, because it's possibly lack of the right type of houses to downsize to.
It is, Jim, and to be honest with you, although it took us, we went into rental thinking we'd maybe do that for 3 or 4 months, and we were there a year. And actually throughout that year, we still had to make compromises on ideally what we wanted. And we've had to make compromises with the house that we're in now, and it is working for us, but it wasn't the ideal vision that we had when we moved. But actually what we wanted just didn't come up, and that was a year we've gone by and it just didn't come up. So at some point you just have to try to keep moving as well.
Yeah. Do you know, that's quite funny you say that, obviously. My mother, she's in her house that we all grew up in. We're not there anymore. It's 3/4 bedrooms, or 3-bedroom, 2 reception, whatever. She's there, and really ideally she needs to downsize, and she spoke about it and never ever got there, never found the right place. And it's like you say, Perry, you had to find somewhere and make it the right place. And I think that's what people need to get over, to downsize and then free up property for people to then obviously move on.
Well, the 50 to 64-year-old people actually feel stuck in their homes, don't they? And therefore, we've nicknamed them the generation stuck. I mean, it's really their inability, you said, Richard, is holding them back to those younger generation renters, to allow them to get up the ladder, if that makes sense. Now, to be honest, I'm still not convinced home ownership is always the way forward. That's just my opinion, and that's coming from an estate agent.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure you should have that mindset.
You've got to remember there's arguments for and against it, depending on your circumstances, and not every single person. And this is why we have to have a mixture of tenures, and that comes down to home ownership and also private rented and also social rent as well. So that's the sort of thing, and even the fact that it comes down to holiday lets as well. Even when you come down to holiday lets and that's the mixture of tenures which makes an economy vibrant in terms of what it is. Also, I think the big thing as well, and maybe people listening out there maybe will confirm this, but I think when I think about my mum and dad, the first thing I say to them is you should maybe downsize, because they're sitting in a 4-bedroom, 3 reception, dining kitchen, on a huge plot on the corner, overlooking the links, but there's only
Just
two
to
of them
do that.
really. Aye, and it's like, why do you know downsize? And you know what they say? It's the hassle of actually having to downsize that puts them off. It's because they've accumulated so much stuff. It's like, what will I do with all this stuff? And it's just that it's almost like the pain's not big enough to compel them to do anything.
Yeah.
And it's only when you get to a stage, it's like, and I have been called out to this recently, when you get people now saying it's like, my costs are going to increase dramatically. And it's my day-to-day cost. It's not my house. It's my day-to-day cost, which will have an impact on me now. So I then have to think about, should I be moving as a result of that?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's driving it now. That's what's changing it. I mean, let's look at the numbers.
Yeah.
So in Fife, there's 15,877 households whose owners are aged between 50 and 64. And they're about to pay their mortgage off on the properties that are worth about 2.5 billion. Now, there's an additional 17,512 mortgage-free households in Fife, with 5 homeowners, for these same homeowners between 50 and 64. And their property is worth about 2.8 billion. So the Fife baby boomers, that's the 60 to 75 people, and the Generation X, which is the 50 to 60, are sitting on roughly about 5.5 billion pounds worth of Fife property. That's a lot of property, because effectively that's round about 33,000 households.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 33,000 households in Fife that they're sitting on, and do they actually need them as a result? That's probably the question you should be asking yourself. And anybody out there listening should be asking yourself, do you actually need the house you actually live in? I know everybody likes to live in their house, and we've all got to a stage where we feel comfortable, and that's what makes us feel comfortable. But at what point do you need to feel uncomfortable? Now, you know what I've done recently. I'm very comfortable in my house, but I'm not a dafty here. I've gone and bought my next house.
Yeah.
And it was a 2-bedroom semi-detached bungalow in the place that I wanted, because I waited for it to come up, and I'm going to rent it till I get it, and I'll move down and then I'll release my house.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well. I think that a lot of people, well, I know that a lot of people develop that sentimental attachment to property as well, and that's what holds them back, along with, like you say, the hassle, and I mean the things that people accumulate over the years, and thinking, oh, this hassle of moving and finding somewhere and then leaving the home that we've lived in for all these years, and there's a combination of factors that make them stay where they are, and that has the knock-on effect. And
I would agree with that. And I think for me, although I didn't have, because we were only in that property for 4 or 5 years, I didn't have the emotional attachment that some will have where my family grew up there, because my family had already grown up. But what I was uncomfortable with was then all of this, as you said, Richard, all of the sentimental things that were in that home that we had accumulated through all of those years. What do you then do with that? And you really do have to be ruthless. And actually, it was quite an emotional experience. And Billy and I had numerous debates, shall we say.
Normally you call it heated discussions.
We're generations mature, so we can have debates. But we literally had boxes, and they would go in one box, and then you'd come down the next day, and it would have moved from that side of the room to the other side of the room. And it's like, you do really have to be ruthless, and it's really, really hard. And actually, even now, after like 2 years of being out of that property, because a year renting and then a year nearly in this one, I still have the situation where I go and think, oh, I'll go and get, and then I think, oh, I don't have that now.
Yeah.
It's probably the only time
you got rid of a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I've probably not needed it in 10 years since, though, but the one time I need it, I don't have it. And there is a lot of that kind of mental block that you have to get over when you're doing it, and it is a big step. We hired a skip, and we were quite ruthless with some things that you couldn't pass on, and it was just junk you were accumulating, like 1970s teas maids, Jim.
Often I go around my mum and dad's house, and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, geez, you've accumulated a lot of stuff, and it's just tart as far as I'm concerned. I know it's got sentimental value for them, they're giving it to gift to each other and all the rest of it, but I just look at it and think, what's the point, eh? It's just stuff that sits there and you have to dust it continuously. And it's like, why do you just live in a sterile room?
I think so. I know we're kind of making light of it a little bit, but actually, what you say there about the actual value in pounds that's assigned to it, Jim, but I think, you know, according to the census, 47.8% of homes occupied by 50 to 64-year-olds have 2 or more spare bedrooms that are never used.
And that's the kicker. So why
That's
do you think that is?
That's
And
nearly
I'll
half
tell
of
you,
the homeowners in that bucket.
I'll tell you exactly why that is. Because my grandkids or my son or my daughter's going to visit. And you've got to think to yourself, and every single time I get that question, I get that answer from people, I'm going to keep them because of this reason. My first response is, how many times do they visit per year? Oh, well, they just maybe come once a year. Okay, so you've got £500,000 property. You could effectively downsize the £250,000 property, release the £250,000 for yourself to do what you want to do, and then every time they come to visit, you can put them up in a hotel. Because literally they only come to visit for a weekend. Because that's usually the response I get, oh, they're just a weekend or a day or something like that. And then they're off doing something else, and you know, because they want to come up here to do other things. So when it comes down to it, that's actually how it happens. So you're paying for heating, cleaning, maintenance on 2 other bedrooms that you don't ever need, and for the majority of the time. It's a classic as well. People have dining rooms and they literally never use them.
My dining room was called the Christmas room because it's the only day we went in it.
The Christmas room.
It was the only day we went
in it.
It was, honestly. The only time I went in it other than that was to clean the thing.
Yeah, and there's what Andrea says. I have 3 spare bedrooms. Now one is a model railway room. Another is a music room. And 1 bed we have for visitors. That's it.
I was just going to say, if you downsize, you could downsize and still have a spare bedroom. So to a point, you could still have visitors, just not as much. So I mean, that's fine, especially if you're coming to a 4, potentially 5-bedroom house.
Richard, look what it costs to put somebody up in I mean, 3 people. You know, a family of 2 adults and 2 children, for example, at a Premier Inn or a travel lodge. It's something like £70 a night. And you're keeping a whole bedroom for a whole year, more or less unoccupied, sitting doing nothing, costing you money every single time, and yet you could just put somebody up for the whole week for £350, and somebody else looks after their linen. That's the idea as well, eh?
That's one of the things, and that kind of ties in with, like we were talking about, the cost of living and things on Monday, Jim. And things that really are necessary, and the things that you're outlaying on that really you don't have to in the grand scheme of things.
So underoccupied is definitely categorized as having at least 2 spare bedrooms. I mean, the rising number of the older Fife homeowners who want to downsize their Fife home are often held back by the lack of this is the key here. It's the lack of suitable housing options for older people and the difficulties of moving. Now, I'm going to say it again, and I couldn't care less if I offend anybody, but this carry on in St Andrews, apparently, where they've got no bungalows and they're building 1,000 houses. I didn't get that. Because most people in St Andrews are elderly and they want to downsize because that's the most of the people I go out to. And the first thing they say, we want to downsize to a more suitable home. And guess what? We're going to build 1,000 houses in St Andrews and we're not building homes for the elderly.
Whereas if they built a lot more bungalows and maybe more like self-contained single story for older people, that's going to free up the houses that are already there for families and aspiring families.
Madness, absolute madness. Now, that might have changed since the planning was through, but I remember when the planning went through originally, I did ask Brian Thompson, the councillor there, you know, we're going to build any suitable homes for elderly people or bungalows or anything like that. And his response was no. So I don't see any reason why that would have changed, but I just generally thought it was all about profit maximisation when it came down to it. And you can't blame the company for doing that because you have to do it, you're allowed to do it. But really the blame lies at the doorstep of the local authority, who should, in the planning department, who should actually be putting conditions on certain buildings that are actually getting, on certain places that are getting built. Now, I've been told time and time again before that, oh, that's not possible. So how is it possible then for me to sit at a housing partnership committee with all the other heads of housing round that table, and then they used to say to me, well, I tell you what, in order to get that land sold off to the social housing providers and provide good value for money, we'll reclassify the land from private development to social development, and it'll actually reduce the price of it, and then we can sell it off to the social housing providers to build. So it was easy enough to do that, but it's not easy enough to force planning through to make sure they actually build a certain amount of bungalows or a certain amount of accommodation, which is appropriate for an aging population.
It should be built with the appropriate expectation that it manages for all generations, shouldn't it?
It goes on everywhere, Perry. The one I was extremely surprised about when we found out about all the bungalows that were getting built at St. Monans.
I was just going to bring up the ones at St. Monans. Yeah.
Really gobsmacked. I could not believe it, and I thought, okay, so if they can do it, why can anybody else not do it? If that's the case, why are we not enforcing this? Why not? Because you know yourself what happens. Well, look at the street I've just bought in. The 2-bedroom, 7-detached bungalow I've got. Most people have actually, because they can do it, they actually go upstairs into the attic.
Convert it, yeah.
So they convert it straight away. So they've actually taken away all that property and actually made it more appropriate for a bigger family. And then that's when you get the carry on about the fact that there's only enough parking out the front for 2 cars at the very most. And then because you've got a bigger family in it, it causes a problem. I'll give you a case in point. Taylor Street.
Yeah.
Taylor Street was only ever built at 1- and 2-bedroom properties. There was never a 3-bedroom property in Taylor Street. And then the 1970s came along and everybody started doing extensions up into their attic. And then you had 4 bedrooms, you had 3 bedrooms, and then now you go into Taylor Street and you're basically aligned with cars all the way down. And literally you can't get in. And you see that with most apartment streets like Glebe Street, Glasson Street. You see it in possibly Lamond Drive. You see it in Balgarve Crescent, in Cooper. You see it in Glenrothes as well, and all these places. All these places that have these flats now have not the appropriate parking because they've actually been overdeveloped. And it is really overdeveloped.
Yeah, totally.
Andrea puts it quite right. She says elderly people need a bungalow when elderly people don't need a bungalow when you can fit in a various stair lifts and rooms. And yeah, you can make a point there, Andrea, but you can't do that for everybody. And also it comes down to economic running costs, and it comes down to the fact that we're back on this generation stuck then because you're stopping generation rent from upgrading. Because now you're taking that house.
Because although the stair lift can be put in and then makes it accessible for the person or okay for the person to stay in the property, you've still not freed up those extra rooms. Do you know what I mean? They're still
I'll be controversial here, Richard. Remember, this legislation came in and said you were going to get your housing allowance cut if you were living in a house and social housing. You were going to get the benefit cut if you were living in a house in social housing, which you actually didn't need. In other words, people were living in 4 bedrooms and there were only 1 of them left. And the idea is like, well, you should really be you should be moving to a property that's more appropriate, and then allowing the family to upgrade into that property. And there was a big hoo-ha about it.
Oh, there's a lot of hoo-ha about it.
And while I don't agree with the benefit cut thing and all the rest of that, what I do agree with is people should be moving to appropriate accommodations to suit their needs. And they shouldn't just be empty rooms. And it's quite apparent here that, there's a lot of empty rooms in properties, and there's an under-occupied category in our housing stock. I mean, the rising number of older Fife homeowners who want to downsize, again, are often struggling to move. Lots of 50-year and over Fife people cannot move home in the way that they're linked to. And that's really due to lack of suitable housing options that can get them stuck in their homes and no longer suitable as they age. And then as they age, what happens is they wait too long. And then what happens out of that is they then are left in a position where they can't move or they have to move. And it's maybe not the right circumstances. And what I mean is, imagine the amount of people that actually waited and then the credit crunch came along. But then the circumstances dictated that they had to move whether they liked it or not. So therefore, they've lost all that value in the downgrade. And now, you could say it's like for like when you downgrade, but if you're moving from a £500,000 house to a £250,000 house, and the proportionate amount has actually been 20% cut, you're losing 20% of 250,000 in a decline like that. And that's what happened to them. Only 1 in 29 people over the age of 50 move home each year, compared to 1 in 15 for the rest of the population. How do we solve that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head in regards to a couple of the points you've made there. You talk about the lack of housing, and I think that's one thing. You talked about obviously that property tax and things like that, and the room taxes that they were looking to do for some of the people that were under occupiers. But the bottom line, even when they put that in place, that was all very well doing that, but they had nowhere to go anyway. So even if they could comply and were willing to move from the 4-bedroom, where were they going to go? Yeah. There isn't anywhere for them to go to. So I think there absolutely is a lack of supply for that kind of last-time buyers. You know, we talk about first-time buyers a lot, don't we?
Planning, Perry. This comes back to the planning. It comes back to the what's getting passed and what's getting allowed to go through. This comes down to what's getting zoned for certain parts. You know, this comes, and the legislation is not there to force people to force house builders to do that in a certain way. Then the government need to look at putting legislation in place in order to do that, so they have an overall picture of what the aging population is like. Because you know, we'll be honest, house builders don't do it. It's all about profit maximisation. Why would they bother anyway? All they're wanting to do is maximise the biggest market possible, and if that ends up being the people are waiting for bungalows, then absolutely they'll turn to the bungalow market. And they'll take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think the thing as well is the fact that actually our last-time buyers, if you want to call them that, are living so much longer as well, aren't they? And they're healthier for longer. So again, actually, they're not in any massive rush in some instances to move. So while there might be a lack of supply, they also necessarily don't want to move. What are you going to say?
Just at that point, the film's Logan's Run popped into my head. Maybe we should bring back Carousel. If anybody knows what that is. Yeah.
I don't.
Richard will not remember that. You'll not remember Logan's Run and Carousel and all the rest of it. And the wee black dot in your hand, it's like, I'm going to a higher place. When you hit 30-year-old.
No.
Aye.
Definitely before
in the 1970s, Logan's Run, there was a film when you hit 30-year-old, this wee black dot appeared, your light went out, and then apparently you were supposed to transition to a higher place. But really, you're killing you off. That was it in a nutshell. And Logan found this out and went, I'm not putting up with this, and did a runner. Hence the reason it's called Logan's Run. So look it up. You might see what it's all about anyway.
Yeah. I don't think that's one of the solutions.
I know, but that's what I was laughing about. But I tell you what, somebody out there will think that's a great idea.
Probably.
So the key here is helping mature Fife homeowners, the generation stuck, to downsize their homes at the right time, and also allowing the younger Fife people, that's a generation rent, to find the family homes that they actually need. Meaning, every generation wins, both young and old, in that process. However, to ensure downsizing works, we need more choices, and for these last-time buyers, because that's what's happening. So we need more choices for the last-time buyers, which is basically the generation stuck. We'd hit the nail on the head here. This is all about building more bungalows and more ground floor apartments. I mean, even ground floor apartments could be good for them, suitable for the middle to older generation. Even apartments with lifts. Yeah. You know, McCarthy Stone is very, very successful at it. They do it all the time, but they charge an absolute fortune for the property maintenance on a yearly basis, the factor fees, and so they're in that business. But there is some model there somewhere for a social structure and a social way of doing this, and it needs somebody to pick up that baton to do it. One way, and as I said before, one way this could be done by changing the planning rules to force builders to build these types of properties, whilst the other could be changing the stamp duty tax rates for downsizers. So
which allows them to move on. Yeah,
and I think in this way, older people will be able to move into homes which will actually suit their specific needs, won't it? It'll also improve their quality of life whilst meeting their goals in life as well, all without becoming detached from their friends and their family and the local area they live. In other words, Fife.
And do you know something? I think that's what you talked about, the St. Monin situation there with the bungalows that were built there, and that's where I think they actually nailed what they did there, because what then happened is the people that live in that community are able to remain in that community. The community then benefited because other parts of the community then moved up, And then,
everybody moved in and bought holiday homes.
not
No, I'm only
everybody.
kidding. Hey, listen, I'll not start that. No, I'm only kidding, because that's what everybody else says, isn't it?
That's a different show.
Right, that's what all the other people. That's what all the people that have nothing say, because it's like they just want to have a go at everything. But what it did do is it allowed the upsizers in the community.
Yeah, that's what I feel. But it also allowed. But it also, go back to that point you made earlier, Jim. It allowed the people who wanted to stay in the village but needed a different type of house to be able to remain where they wanted to live and see their lives out, if that's potentially what these people wanted to do. So it allows them to remain within their community, as you say, with their friends, their families, and what they enjoy doing in their lives, and live in a beautiful spot.
It also allows possibly Generation Stuck to move to rented accommodation, Richard, doesn't it?
Yeah,
because that's my intention. I've just moved to rented accommodation. I've got no intention of keeping my hold of a big house. I sat with somebody the other day, actually, and I was sitting in their house, and it's worth about 350,000 to 400,000. But they were actually looking at ways in order to get that money out, because it's like it's completely paid off, and you're living in that house till you go, but basically you're sitting on £400,000, and you can't do a damn thing with it because you're living in it. So how do you get that money out? Do you do equity release? That's an option. Do you sell it to your children, and then they pay you the money, and they have the mortgage on it, which you then pay, and then eventually when you go, they have all that they own that property, and you get their money out. Do you then sell it, and you move into rented accommodation? Do you sell it and move down and downgrade to a different type of accommodation? That's all these different things, but it's going to be frustrating, and it was for them to sit there and think, all this money is just going to, I mean, great, it'll go to our family, and all the rest of it. But in my context, I've always said to my mum and dad, I wish you would just go and spend it for yourself. I didn't need that. I didn't want that. That doesn't mean to say, mum and dad, you should give it to my brothers and sisters.
It's interesting.
I still do want it, by the way. No, I didn't. but you don't need it by that time, do you? By the time, I've always said this, by the time you go, eventually, because you'll live a long age, your sons and daughters have all grown up and they've all made their own life anyway. So anything you actually leave to them and think, oh, that'll leave and that'll help you on your way, well, you should have really given them it when it was sooner. You shouldn't have waited all these years because by that time they're sorted and they're on track. So, or maybe just give it to your grandchildren. Maybe that's the next. Skip that generation, give it to the grandchildren, and leave it in a trust for them to look after them for things like for later on in life. Because we know later on in life, we've done this in successive shows, Richard, that later on in life for the very young generation, the generation, I don't know what they call them, generation 20s or noughties or whatever it is, that generation is going to really struggle when they get older because there's going to be nothing. We see it already. You see things like the national health system, the dentists and that. I mean, you've got dentists out there that are saying we're only taking private patients now. We're not interested in NHS anymore. And the government's going, but we've not got enough money to fund the NHS. And then it's like, well, you know where this is going. So then you've got to look at the really younger generation and think to your grandchildren that and think to yourself, well, how can I help them? Because they're going to need it.
They're going to need to pay for their healthcare to some extent. And it's interesting you see that, Jim, because
pensions are not going to exist either. That's why they're forcing everybody into company pensions.
Yeah, and like you say, the generation stuck. I mean, I've seen it progressively becoming more common that people do sell their properties and rent and take that they've got that money, they enjoy that money, they pass it on, or do you know what I mean? And that's what they choose to do. And that's been a bit more a common thing because, well, rather than find somewhere to downsize to, well, they can't find somewhere to downsize to buy, then they rent instead.
There's nothing that grates me more. There's nothing that grates me more when I see an elderly couple that have saved all their life to look after themselves in their elderly age. They've paid off their mortgage. They've got that big house and all the rest of it. And something happens and they go into care and the government just goes, thank you very much.
Yep.
And that's what really annoys me. And the fact that they've scrimped and saved all their life. And then they're just like, we're taking it, whether you like it or not. That's what really frustrates me. And that's why I talk about this, about releasing equity, about doing something about it now and passing it on to your children before that happens. Because you don't know when that's going to happen. I mean, I could wake up tomorrow, hopefully, touch wood, I don't. But you saw it, one of my friends, 55-year-old, got in his bed in the middle of the night, massive stroke, switched off the life support next day. Literally, that was it. And that could happen to anybody. Any circumstance. So you want to make sure you're in a position to move forward and actually do something about it, and not be in that position where everything just gets taken away from you. And that's everything you've planned for the rest of your generations to come, for that reason. And that's why I think it's important for even this article about Generation Stuck is just more importantly, it's just to stimulate that conversation for people out there at that age group that feel they are the Generation Stuck, and start to look at their options now before it becomes too late and you can't do anything else about it. That's when the regret will come. So it's the whole thing of what I say, Richard. I say it all the time. I says, if you're not going to pay the price now, wait till you get the bill from regret.
For regret, regret will
cost a hell of a lot more for not doing something about your situation right now. But everybody will go through our life thinking we're going to survive and going to live forever. But we need to actually focus on this and actually say to ourselves, right, where are we right now? What do we need to do? And to make sure we minimize the circumstances surrounding this, and make sure this wealth that we've accumulated actually gets passed on to the right people and actually doesn't get absorbed by everyone else. And that's where this all comes from, really, and all this thing. I mean, we're sitting, that generation from 50-year-old and upwards is sitting on £5.5 billion worth of property. And half of that is actually paid off completely. So that's a big amount of money that could be passed on to the next generation. So all I'm saying to people out there, when I'm just my final words on this, is make sure you plan property properly for your future, and make sure you get the right advice from the right people and get the facts first before you take the next steps. Don't rely on opinions. Easy to get facts. This is why I'm going back to this couple, tell them the valuation of their house, tell them, I'll put them in touch with an equity release specialist just to give them an idea of what their circumstances could be. And then I'm also putting them in touch with a solicitor as well, so they can tell them what they would need to do if they decide that they maybe want to be a lifetime tenant and pass that asset on to their children right now, and actually just do a lifetime tenancy. But that's not something that I'm specialist in, but I do know people are specialists in that. And I think that's the most important thing I could pass on right now in this conversation, if I was going to finalise everything off. What about you, Perry? What's your thoughts on the final thoughts?
I think for me, you're absolutely right, Jim. It's about that educational piece and people understanding it. And when you look at the fact that 50% of those age bracket people are sitting with nothing more on the property, in a house that's bigger for them, but holding on to it for all the sentimental reasons, or because it's the family home, etc., or because they haven't found anything else. And then when they do become poorly, potentially they could end up with nothing, and they've worked all their days. And it's a kind of old school of thought, isn't it, back then, in regards to, we'll do this and it'll be for the family and it'll be there when they have it. We as a family personally experienced that, where we had to sell a family home for care. I deal with clients all the time that are in that situation because they've not proactively possibly kind of got that good advice and guidance on what they potentially could have available to them, so that doesn't happen. So for me, and what these shows are always about, it's really about us just trying to help them and point them in the right direction. As you say, we're no specialists, but it's about information share and equip yourself with that, and then go out and try and find the answers that's going to maybe give you the result that you need as your family.
Yeah. What about yourself, Richard? I mean, you're obviously, Richard, you're 20 years younger than me. So, you've got all this to come. So what's your thoughts on this from that younger generation?
Yeah, I think it's good for the younger generation to realise and like you say, think and plan ahead. I think for people that are already there in that generation stuck, it's good to have these conversations and think about where things are going to go and how you're going to downsize. And if you're stuck on options to downsize, I mean, it's not always just, well, I need to find a bungalow, or I need to find a one-bedroom apartment on the ground level to buy. You could always, there's renting options and things, and I see a lot of people doing that. But definitely the main thing is that builders and developers need to look at this and think, and obviously take into consideration that there needs to be more housing like that built in order for people to move on. But like you say, it's not the builders and the developers' faults. It's because they're allowed to do it in a more profitable way, so they're going to do that.
If you allow them to do it, they'll do it.
But yeah, people at my age and even younger, and I think really should be thinking, planning ahead, definitely.
Good stuff. Thanks very much for your time, guys. Really appreciate that. If anybody's got any questions later on, if you've watched this in the rerun or you listen to the podcast and you're listening in, please feel free to message us direct if you want on any of our Facebook channels. You can get us obviously on our usual phone numbers on our website, and also you can just send an email on info@fifeproperties.co.uk. And until next week's midweek show, it's bye-bye from him. We've worked it all out now, eh?
We've got it sussed.
Bye, folks.
Bye, everyone.